I'd been talking to Matt on Hinge for a few weeks, and he seemed completely normal. He was an outdoorsy guy, and his photos were full of mountain hikes and trips with his dog. He came off as adventurous but laid back, and I liked that. We decided to meet up for a hike at a popular trail I'd been to before. At first, everything was fine. He was funny, polite, and he seemed like a nice guy. We talked about the usual stuff: work, family, hobbies. But about halfway up the trail, he started asking really personal questions, like really personal. He asked if I lived alone, if I'd ever been hurt hiking alone, and what I'd do if I got lost. I laughed it off, but the question started to feel invasive, like he was trying to get me to reveal my vulnerabilities. As we got deeper into the woods, I noticed he kept steering us off the main path. He kept saying he knew a better spot where we'd get an amazing view, but every time it just led us further away from the familiar trails. My gut was telling me something was wrong, so I tried to suggest we turn back, but he insisted we keep going. Then he stopped, turned to me, and asked, "Do you trust me?" My heart skipped a beat, and all I could think was, "No." I forced a laugh and told him we should head back before it got dark. His whole demeanor shifted. He looked annoyed, maybe even angry. Without saying anything, he nodded, but the vibe had completely changed. As we made our way down, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every time I looked back, he was staring at me, unblinking, like he was calculating something. Finally, I saw the parking lot in the distance and felt a wave of relief. But when we got there, he just stopped, stared at me and said, "I'll see you around." I didn't reply. I just got in my car and drove off. Later that night, he texted me, "You got lucky today." Chills ran down my spine, and I blocked him immediately. A few days later, I checked his profile to report him, and it was gone, like he'd vanished into thin air. I have no idea who I actually went hiking with that day, but I'm haunted by the feeling that I might have been part of something much darker if I'd let my guard down for even a second. I matched with Emma on Hinge. Her profile was a bit generic: selfies, beach photos, a shot with her dog. She looked cute and seemed normal, so I didn't think much of it. We started chatting, and she came across as funny, maybe a bit quirky. She'd often make these strange jokes about fate, like we were meant to be, even though we'd just started talking. After a week of texting, she asked if we could meet up. I was open to it, but something about her was starting to feel off. She'd avoid video calls, always had an excuse ready, like her camera was broken or her internet was acting up. I was starting to wonder if she looked different from her photos, but I let it slide. People get nervous online, right? The day we were supposed to meet, she texted, saying she had to cancel because she was nervous. I told her it was fine and we could reschedule if she wanted, but instead of calming down, she got intense. She started sending long messages about how she felt rejected, how she didn't want to be just another girl to me. I told her we could take things slow, but it only made her more upset. She kept insisting she was the one and that I just needed to give her a chance. I was getting pretty uncomfortable, so I tried to distance myself, only texting her back now and then. But every time I replied, she'd flood me with paragraphs, rants about how I didn't appreciate her, about how she was ready to give me everything and I was ruining it. It was way too much, and eventually I told her I didn't think this was going to work out. She went silent for a few days, which I thought was a good sign. I figured maybe she'd moved on. Then, one night around 11, I got a text from an unknown number. "I'm outside. Please, just talk to me." I froze. I hadn't given her my address. I didn't know how she'd found me, but I didn't reply. I hoped she'd leave if I ignored her. But then, the knocking started. Quiet at first, like she didn't want to make a scene, but it quickly got louder, more desperate. I looked through the peephole, and sure enough, a woman was standing there. She looked nothing like the girl in the photos, not even close. Her face was hidden mostly by a hood, but I could see enough to know it wasn't Emma or whoever she was pretending to be. I backed away, not sure what to do. My phone buzzed with another text. "I know you're in there. You owe me this." At this point, I was freaking out. I yelled through the door that I was going to call the police if she didn't leave. She stopped knocking and I heard her whisper, "You'll regret this." When I looked through the peephole again, she was gone. I called the building manager to report it, but they couldn't do much. I blocked her number, deleted Hinge, and hoped that would be the end of it. But a few days later, I found a letter slipped under my door. There was no name, just the words, "I'll be back when you're ready for me." That was 3 months ago. Every so often, I'll find a note or a weird gift outside my door. She never leaves a name, but the messages are always the same. We're meant to be. I met Jake on Hinge. He seemed like a great guy, polite, well-spoken, had a stable job, and he even volunteered on weekends. He was like the total opposite of the guys I'd been dating. After chatting for a few weeks, he asked if I wanted to go out to dinner. I was excited, and we set up a date for Friday night. The date itself was great. Jake was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But something about him was off. Whenever I tried to talk about my family or friends, he'd steer the conversation back to me or to himself. It was like he wanted all my attention, and anything outside of that didn't matter. After dinner, he offered to drive me home. I usually wouldn't accept, but he'd seemed harmless enough. I told him I had a roommate, and he seemed disappointed. He asked if I lived with anyone else, like my parents or a boyfriend, and when I said no, his whole demeanor shifted. I shrugged it off, thinking I was reading too much into things. The weirdness continued over the next week. Jake would send me messages about how lucky he felt to have found me, how we were meant to be. Then he started talking about wanting to meet my family, despite us only knowing each other for a couple of weeks. I tried to joke around, telling him it was too soon, but he didn't laugh. He just replied, "Maybe sooner than you think." A few nights later, I was home alone, lying in bed when I heard a tapping sound on my window. I live on the second floor, so it didn't make any sense. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the wind, but then I got a text from Jake. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." I panicked, grabbing my phone to call the police. The tapping kept going, rhythmic and slow, like he wanted to toy with me. When the police arrived, they didn't find anyone, but I felt that chill. Somehow, he'd found my address. After that, I blocked his number, deleted Hinge, and didn't leave my apartment alone for weeks. One morning, I found a single rose on my doorstep with a note, "You can't hide from fate." I moved out 2 months later. Every so often, I'll get an email or message from a fake account with that same phrase, "You can't hide from fate." He's still out there, watching, waiting. It's a reminder that you never really know who you're meeting online.